You stub your toe on the corner of your bed at 6 a.m., and before your brain has even processed what happened, a word flies out of your mouth. Not a sentence, not a thought, just one sharp, automatic word, summoned from somewhere you didn't consciously choose. Where did that come from? Here's the question nobody asks. When did humans start swearing? And the answer involves brain damage, ancient Roman graffiti, a medieval Englishman with possibly the worst surname in recorded history, toddlers who understand profanity before they understand grammar, and a part of your brain so old that you share it with lizards. Let's start with something genuinely strange. Swearing isn't language, not in the way the rest of your speech is language. When you have a normal conversation, your brain uses a network on the left side called Broca's area and Wernicke's area. These regions handle grammar, vocabulary, sentence structure, all the complex machinery that lets you form the sentence you're hearing right now in your head. It's sophisticated, it's uniquely human, it took millions of years of evolution to build. Swearing doesn't use that system, at all. Neuroscientists have studied stroke patients and people with severe brain injuries who lose almost all ability to speak. They can't form sentences, they can't recall basic vocabulary. Ask them to name a chair, and they'll stare at you blankly. But many of these same patients, when they get frustrated, when they're in pain, when something goes wrong, they swear. Fluently, automatically, completely intact. That shouldn't be possible if swearing worked the same way as normal language, but it is possible, because swearing comes from somewhere else entirely. It comes from the limbic system, specifically, structures called the basal ganglia and the amygdala, buried deep in the middle of your brain. These aren't new evolutionary inventions, they're ancient. You share versions of this system with dogs, with lizards, with almost every vertebrate on the planet. It's the part of your brain responsible for raw emotion, threat detection, fight or flight. In other words, swearing isn't really speech in the traditional sense. It's closer to a bark. A controlled, word-shaped version of the exact same system a dog uses to growl when it's startled. So if swearing taps into something this primitive, something this old, the real question isn't when did humans start swearing. The real question is whether something like swearing existed before humans even had language at all. Let's think about this carefully. Modern complex language, the kind with grammar and syntax and the ability to describe abstract concepts, is thought to have emerged somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago, give or take a very contested amount of scientific disagreement. But emotional vocalizations, sharp involuntary sounds triggered by pain, fear, or frustration, are far, far older. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, make sharp alarm calls when startled or threatened. These aren't words. They don't have grammar. But they serve almost exactly the same neurological function that a curse word serves in you. An instant, involuntary, emotionally loaded vocalization that bypasses complex thought entirely. If you trace this back, the basic biological circuit for swearing, the part of the brain doing the actual work, may predate language itself by millions of years. Early hominids smashing a finger with a rock probably made some kind of sharp, involuntary sound, long before anyone had invented a single word. Which means by the time actual language evolved, the swearing system was already sitting there, fully formed, just waiting for words to plug into it. This explains something that should otherwise seem completely bizarre. Every single human language and culture ever studied has some version of taboo words. Every one. There's no documented human society, anywhere, at any point in history, that exists entirely without profanity. Different words, different taboos, wildly different cultural rules about what's offensive. But the underlying behavior, having a special category of forbidden, emotionally charged words, is universal. That's not a coincidence. That's a feature built directly into the architecture of the human brain. Here's where it gets even stranger. Children figure this out long before they understand what any of these words actually mean. Developmental researchers have found that toddlers as young as 2 or 3 can already identify that certain words carry a different emotional weight, even though they have no idea what the words refer to. They notice the reaction, the sharp intake of breath from a parent, the sudden change in tone, the way adults look at each other instead of at them. Long before a child understands the literal meaning of a taboo word, they understand that the word is special, that it carries some kind of forbidden power, purely from observing how the people around them react to it. This means taboo language is one of the very first social rules children absorb, not through explanation, but through pure emotional pattern recognition. Nobody sits a toddler down and explains etymology. They just watch a room go quiet, or watch a sibling get in trouble, and file the word away under words that matter more than other words. It's a strange kind of inheritance. You don't learn which words are taboo. You absorb it, the same way you absorb which facial expressions mean danger, long before you could explain why. And once you do understand a language fully, something else interesting happens. Something that gets at just how deeply embedded the system really is. Researchers studying bilingual and multilingual speakers have found a consistent pattern. Swearing in your first language, the language you grew up with, the language your brain learned to process emotion in, hits differently than swearing in a language you learned later in life. People report that cursing in a second or third language feels noticeably less intense, less visceral, almost like saying the word in air quotes. The exact same word, with the exact same dictionary definition, carries dramatically less emotional weight if it wasn't wired into your limbic system during early childhood. This is measurable, by the way. Studies tracking skin conductance, basically how much someone sweats in response to a stimulus, show stronger physiological reactions to taboo words in a person's native language compared to taboo words in a learned second language. The word itself doesn't matter as much as when and how it got installed in your brain. This is also exactly why swearing can feel oddly safe in a foreign language. International travelers and language learners often report using profanity in a second language far more casually than they ever would in their first, precisely because it doesn't trigger the same deep emotional alarm. The taboo is technically still there. It just isn't wired into the older, more primitive part of the brain the same way. Now here's a layer to this that completely flips the script on what most people assume swearing is even for. We tend to think of swearing as purely negative, rude, aggressive, something polite people avoid. But research on social bonding tells a much more complicated story. Studies on group dynamics have found that swearing among close friends, in the right context, actually increases trust and feelings of closeness. It works almost like a social password. Swearing casually around someone signals a level of comfort, informality, and shared understanding that more polite, careful language doesn't communicate as effectively. You don't swear around your boss on your first day. You do swear around your closest friends, and the fact that you feel safe enough to do so is itself a small act of trust. This flips the entire framing. Swearing isn't just an emotional release valve for pain or anger. It's also, in the right social context, a bonding tool, a way of signaling, I feel comfortable enough around you to drop the careful, filtered version of myself. Which brings us back to something we touched on earlier with ancient hunter-gatherer groups and campfire storytelling. Humans have always used language, in all its forms, polite and impolite, to build and reinforce social bonds. Swearing, it turns out, is just one more tool in that same ancient social toolkit. Just one that happens to also be wired directly into the brain's emotional core. So once actual language did develop, what did ancient swearing sound like? Honestly, we have no direct way of knowing. Spoken language from 50,000 years ago left no recordings, no transcripts, nothing. The oldest evidence we have of anything resembling swearing comes from written history, which means we're missing tens of thousands of years of the story entirely. But once writing appears, the evidence shows up almost immediately, and it's spectacular. In ancient Rome, when the city of Pompeii was buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, it preserved something unexpected: graffiti. Hundreds of pieces of graffiti scratched into walls by ordinary Romans, and a striking number of it is exactly what you'd expect from bored people with sharp objects and time to kill. Insults, crude jokes, boasts about sexual conquests, complaints about specific named individuals in deeply unflattering terms. This is, essentially, ancient social media. The exact same impulse that makes someone today leave a savage comment under a stranger's post existed in Pompeii 2,000 years ago, just carved into stone instead of typed on a screen. The ancient Romans also had an extensive, highly specific vocabulary of profanity, much of it tied to two major themes that show up across almost every culture in history: bodily functions and sexual acts. Roman insults frequently targeted a person's masculinity, specifically suggesting they had taken a passive role in a sexual encounter, which in Roman culture was considered the deepest possible insult to a man's status. The Greeks had similarly elaborate systems of insult, often invoking specific gods to curse an enemy through inscribed lead tablets, essentially ancient curse as a service, buried in the ground to make the magic permanent. Here's something almost nobody knows. In 2015, a historian going through English court records from the year 1310 found a name that has since become somewhat legendary in linguistic history. A man was registered in the records, required to appear in court multiple times, and simply never showed up, eventually being declared an outlaw. His full name, recorded officially, contained what is now considered one of the earliest documented uses of a word still very much in use today, embedded directly into his surname. Whether his name was a genuine description of an event, an insult given to him by an annoyed neighbor, or some kind of bureaucratic clerical error nobody ever bothered to correct, we'll never fully know. But somewhere in 1310, an English court clerk wrote down a word that, 700 years later, would still get bleeped on television. What's fascinating is how consistent the categories of swearing have remained across this entire span of recorded history. Words about bodily functions, words about sex, words insulting someone's family or lineage, words invoking religious damnation. These four categories show up again and again, in Latin, in Old English, in medieval manuscripts, in modern slang. The specific words change constantly. The underlying categories almost never do. This tells us something important. Swearing isn't really about the words themselves. The words are just labels we attach to categories our brains already consider taboo: the body, sex, death, religion, family honor. Strip away the specific vocabulary, and what's left is a remarkably stable map of what humans have found emotionally charged and socially forbidden for thousands of years, across wildly different civilizations that had no contact with each other whatsoever. There's one more piece of this story that ties everything together, and it has to do with what happens when society tries to suppress this ancient system entirely. Throughout history, every culture that has identified taboo words has also tried to control them. Medieval scribes wrote certain words only as a single letter followed by blank space, too uncomfortable to spell them out even in private manuscripts. Victorian England developed an entire culture of euphemism, so extreme that even the word leg was considered too suggestive in polite company, replaced with limb. 20th century broadcasting standards created the bleep, a sudden burst of tone specifically engineered to censor a word at the exact moment it would have been spoken. An entire piece of technology built solely to manage this one specific category of human utterance. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. None of it has ever worked completely. Not once. In the entire history of every civilization that has tried. Every time a culture successfully suppresses one taboo word, a new one rises to take its place almost immediately. Linguists call this the euphemism treadmill. A word becomes too taboo to say directly, so people invent a softer replacement. Given enough time, that replacement itself becomes associated with the taboo subject and starts to feel just as forbidden as the original. So a newer, softer term gets invented. And the cycle repeats indefinitely, generation after generation, language after language. This isn't a failure of willpower or social discipline. It's a direct consequence of the fact that the underlying drive doesn't live in the part of the brain that responds to social rules about vocabulary. You can ban a specific word. You cannot ban the limbic system. The ancient circuitry generating the impulse doesn't care what society has decided this week is the acceptable term. It simply needs an outlet, and language, endlessly creative, keeps supplying new ones. Even sign languages, which have no spoken sound at all, develop their own taboo gestures and signs, complete with their own social rules about when and where they're appropriate. Deaf children, just like hearing children, learn to recognize forbidden signs years before they fully understand their meaning, watching the exact same kind of reaction from the adults around them. The medium changes entirely: sound, gesture, written word. The underlying behavior doesn't change at all. This is, in a strange way, one of the most convincing pieces of evidence that swearing is a fundamental feature of being human rather than a learned bad habit. You can change the words, you can change the punishment for using them. You can invent entire broadcasting technologies dedicated to silencing them in real time. But you cannot engineer a human culture that simply doesn't have them, because the system generating the need for them isn't running on culture. It's running on biology that predates culture entirely. There's also genuinely useful science here, and this is where it gets interesting in a completely different direction. Researchers have studied what swearing actually does to your body when you do it. In a series of experiments, participants were asked to submerge their hand in painfully cold water and keep it there as long as possible. One group was told to repeat a neutral word. Another group was told to swear, repeatedly, out loud. The swearing group tolerated the cold water significantly longer than the neutral word group. Their heart rate increased, suggesting an activation of the fight or flight response, and that physiological arousal appeared to genuinely blunt their perception of pain. Swearing, it turns out, isn't just venting. It's a measurable physical pain management tool, hardwired into a part of your brain that existed long before anyone invented ibuprofen. This might explain something that feels intuitively true to basically everyone who has ever stubbed a toe, dropped something heavy on their foot, or touched a surface far hotter than expected. The curse word that flies out isn't a failure of self-control. It's your ancient limbic system doing exactly the job it evolved to do: respond instantly to sudden pain or threat in the fastest, most primitive way available, completely bypassing the slower, more sophisticated language system that would otherwise have to construct a proper sentence about your distress. In a very real sense, every time you swear after stubbing your toe, you're not really speaking. You're doing something closer to what every vertebrate on the planet does when startled or hurt. You're just doing it with a word your specific culture happened to load with taboo meaning, instead of a growl, a yelp, or a screech. So when did ancient humans start swearing? The honest answer is that the underlying system, the actual brain circuitry responsible for the behavior, almost certainly predates language itself, possibly by millions of years. The specific words are recent by comparison, emerging and evolving constantly throughout recorded history, always clustering around the same handful of taboo categories: the body, sex, religion, family, death. Every language on Earth has them. Every culture has rules about when you can use them and who's allowed to hear them. Every toddler learns to recognize them before they understand them. And every single time you swear, whether out loud or just inside your head, you're activating a piece of neural machinery so ancient, so deeply embedded, that brain damage severe enough to erase your ability to speak and complete sentences often leaves this one specific function completely untouched. The next time you stub your toe and something flies out of your mouth before you've even decided to say anything, remember what's actually happening. You're not losing control. You're using the oldest, most reliable communication system you have, the one that was already fully operational long before anyone had invented a single proper word. Somewhere, a Roman scratching graffiti into a wall in Pompeii 2,000 years ago felt exactly the same impulse you do, reaching for exactly the same kind of word, generated by exactly the same ancient part of the brain. Some things, it turns out, really are timeless.